Hey guys, how y'all doing? So lately, there's been a lot of hate towards the X-Men franchise from Fox, which I think is totally unfair. If you look back, the original X-Men is the reason comic book movies dominate the box office today. And it's weird to see the franchise getting so much hate when it's one of the biggest reasons the Marvel Cinematic Universe exists today. Alright, to start this video, let's go over a little history lesson. X-Men, directed by Bryan Singer, came out in 2000, and it was a huge success. This was at the time when comic book movies weren't taken seriously, especially after movies like Batman and Robin completely destroyed all the credibility the genre had. 2000's X-Men played a big role in showing audiences, hey, these movies can be good. This movie was realistic, and it took itself seriously, which is what audience needed at the time. Sure, later they became more open to campy movies like Spider-Man and ridiculous movies like Guardians of the Galaxy, but at the time, they needed a movie like X-Men. Sure, now the original X-Men doesn't hold up that well, especially the effects and some of the dialogue.
Know what happens to a toad when it's struck by lightning? Same thing that happens to everything else.
But I can still appreciate what this movie did for the genre, not to mention the nearly perfect cast, like Hugh Jackman's Wolverine and Patrick Stewart's Professor X and Ian McKellen's Magneto. This movie is the reason the X-Men franchise has lasted 19 years. Without Bryan Singer's directing and the great cast, everything would have turned out very differently for the X-Men. Hell, maybe even for Marvel. This movie was the first movie Kevin Feige got to produce. For those of you who don't know, Kevin Feige is the current president of Marvel Studios and is the reason for the Marvel Cinematic Universe existing. Kevin Feige has been trying to make an interconnected universe with Marvel characters since the first X-Men. Wolverine was originally going to have a cameo in the first Spider-Man until they couldn't find the suit. And they even mentioned Doctor Strange in Spider-Man 2. Sure, this version of the MCU didn't pan out, but without X-Men, the MCU probably wouldn't exist. The original X-Men gave Kevin Feige the chance to prove himself as a competent producer. So after the first X-Men came out, X2, X-Men United came out 3 years later, in 2003. This movie was pretty great. It took a lot of what we liked in the first X-Men, and it fleshed it out more. It showed us the struggle mutants faced in the same way gay people struggled to come out, and unlike the first X-Men, X2 actually holds up by today's standards. Sure, it's a little cheesy and the effects don't always hold up, but it's more interesting than the original X-Men. The original X-Men has served as a template for so many movies, such as like all of its sequels, the Avengers, and I guess Justice League, because Justice League copied the Avengers. And by today's standards, the original X-Men is very cliche and average. What separates movies like X2 from X-Men, though, is sure, they have Magneto and Charles arguing and Wolverine doing stuff, but X2 and most of the sequels have way more substance to their stories than the original. So, after X-Men 2, X-Men The Last Stand came out in 2006. This movie was very disappointing and was a huge mess. The director of the first two X-Men movies, Bryan Singer, dropped out to direct Superman Returns, so 20th Century Fox got Matthew Vaughn to direct. This movie was originally going to be based off of the Dark Phoenix saga, but 20th Century Fox wasn't sure about that, so Matthew Vaughn added the Cure storyline. But then Matthew Vaughn also dropped out, so the studio got Brett Ratner to take over the movie, and Brett Ratner was not a good choice to direct this movie. He mostly focused on cool special effects rather than story, and the movie suffered a lot because of this. Now, I'm not sure if it would have been any better if Matthew Vaughn stayed, but considering what he did with X-Men First Class, it probably would have at least been decent. Okay, so after X-Men 3 sucked, the studio released X-Men Origins Wolverine, which has become the laughingstock of the X-Men franchise. So much so that Deadpool constantly makes fun of it for what it did to his character. They took the most interesting aspects of Deadpool and completely stripped them away for some bland mashup of a bunch of mutant powers. Not only that, but this movie didn't do anything to make Wolverine interesting. When he's by himself, he's invincible, so there is no tension. That's why the better Wolverine movies always do something to take away his mutant healing. When he's with the X-Men, there's tension because they can die, but when he's by himself, there is no tension. Anyways, enough of that. After X-Men 3 and Origins, many people gave up on the franchise and still haven't gone back to it since. But then, X-Men First Class came out, and it was pretty good. It didn't make that much money considering how tainted the franchise image had become, especially since Wolverine wasn't even in the trailers or anything, but it was a pretty good movie. Some of the dialogue is awful, and the special effects are weird, but for the most part, it was a pretty well-made movie. James McAvoy and Michael Fassbender as young Charles and Magneto were perfectly cast, and the movie didn't focus on Wolverine this time, which was a breath of fresh air. So, after X-Men First Class brought the X-Men back, The Wolverine came out in 2013, and it was a pretty decent movie. Not much to say, it was just alright. I know it seems like I'm kind of just brushing over this one, but it's honestly, it doesn't really have to do much with the other ones, so let's move on. Then, X-Men Days of Future Past came out, and it's honestly one of the best X-Men movies. Bryan Singer came back and tied together the original X-Men trilogy with First Class beautifully, and even erased what happened in X-Men 3 and X-Men Days of Future Past. This was such an interesting way of rebooting the franchise, because it still paid homage to the original X-Men. This movie is honestly fantastic, and it never gets old. If you've been following the X-Men movies, then this movie is everything you would want. And even if you haven't, this movie perfectly stands on its own legs, and works fine as a standalone movie. I remember my art teacher talking about it, and talking about how it's her first time watching a superhero movie, or the first time watching an X-Men movie. I really can't remember it that well since this happened like 4 years ago. This movie brought back the X-Men again. After First Class made the X-Men credible again, Days of Future Past made the X-Men popular again. And it's honestly fantastic. Okay, so after Days of Future Past, people were finally excited for the next X-Men movie, which had not been the case for some time. Then, X-Men Apocalypse came out, and it got mixed reviews. Bryan Singer was still directing, along with Simon Kinberg writing the script, but the movie was not that good. I personally enjoy every scene on its own, but they don't flow well together, and that's mostly because of its inconsistent tone. Michael Fassbender, James McAvoy, and Evan Peters are still great as their characters, but Apocalypse in this movie is so poorly written. He has no motivation, and his design is horrible. There was an unused design for him from Ironhead Studios that looks so much better. Well, anyways, this movie wasn't that good, and now the internet thinks the X-Men series is horrible because they made 3 bad movies out of 11 good ones. This movie was just all over the place. Bryan Singer even talked about how him and Simon Kinberg focused on giving Apocalypse a motivation.
To him, it's one giant, corrupt civilization, the whole planet, worshipping false idols, thinking it has superpowers with its nuclear weapons, and he believes this is not his world, and he wants to take it back.
Well, you know what? I'm sorry, Simon Kinberg and Bryan Singer, but you guys failed at giving Apocalypse a motivation. It's never conveyed. Well, anyways, this movie wasn't that good, and now the internet thinks the X-Men series is horrible again. So the same year X-Men Apocalypse came out, Deadpool came out, and it was a huge hit. There isn't much to say since everything I think of this movie has already been said. It's pretty decent and really funny, and it made fun of a lot of what people don't like about the X-Men movies. This movie is also the reason Logan ended up being rated R. Deadpool proved that rated R comic book movies can still make a lot of money. I honestly like Deadpool 2 more than the first one, since it's better directed and way more creative. So the year after Deadpool came out, Logan hit the big screen. And this movie is honestly the best X-Men movie. It was a beautiful send-off to Patrick Stewart's Professor X and Hugh Jackman's Wolverine. It was emotional, depressing, and gave us what Marvel Studios would never give us. This movie was the finale of a franchise. Sure, there are more X-Men movies coming out, but this movie technically takes place in 2029, so way after any of them. This movie is not only the best Wolverine and X-Men movie, it's the best Marvel movie, which is crazy to think since Marvel didn't even make it. If you're a fan of Marvel and you haven't seen any of the X-Men movies, you need to at least watch this film. It's just a great piece of cinema. Honestly, if you've never gotten into the X-Men series, I recommend watching, if you only want to watch 2 movies or something like that, I recommend watching X-Men Days of Future Past and Logan. And if you want to watch like, I guess like 3, then go ahead and watch First Class and then Days of Future Past and Logan. You can completely just ignore Apocalypse. You know, for everything the X-Men franchise has done for Marvel, they get a lot of hate, which is completely unfair. They brought us some of the most creative superhero films and helped jumpstart Marvel's comeback into the mainstream. When I see websites saying the X-Men series has been quote-unquote hit or miss and mostly misses, it pisses me off. 3 bad movies out of 11 good ones doesn't equal more misses than hits. This franchise deserves more than it gets. I honestly prefer the X-Men franchise over the MCU and especially the DCEU. Sure, the timeline is confusing, it doesn't make any sense, and the special effects aren't as good as Infinity Wars or Batman vs Superman's, but at the end of the day, the X-Men movies have been giving directors what Marvel doesn't, and that's freedom. Freedom to create whatever kind of movie they want. Freedom to make something special and unique. If Marvel Studios owned the X-Men, you really think they would let movies like Logan and Deadpool come out? We'll have to wait and find out. But in the meantime, let's take a moment to appreciate the X-Men series. Whether Dark Phoenix is as horrible as people are saying it's going to be, or as great as some X-Men fans keep insisting, or whether if New Mutants even comes out at all, the X-Men franchise will always hold a special place in my heart. And let's be honest here. When the MCU doesn't reboot the X-Men in the exact same way the fans want, people are going to start saying they miss the old movies. It happened with Spider-Man Homecoming, and it's going to happen again with the X-Men. Anyways, guys, that's it for the video, and I will see you guys later.
And to my mutant brothers and sisters out there, I say this: no more hiding, no more suffering.
You have lived in the shadows in shame and fear for too long. Come out. Join me. Fight together in a brotherhood of our kind. A new tomorrow that starts today.